So tonight we're going to talk about a history of the supernatural. And so I just want to tell you a little bit about myself. So I've been in the publishing business for over 25 years. So I spent 25 years at Penguin Random House and had a number of different jobs, but the last 11 years I worked in editorial and was really blessed and just fortunate to work with some really terrific authors out there. So I currently work for Loyola Press in Chicago. So I left Penguin Random House a couple of years ago because I wanted to try something different and get involved in children's books. And but I'm still Deepak Chopra's editor over at Penguin, and so I'm just up here as just a number of books that I've worked on really in the last few years. And so my specialty was religion and spirituality, and so I've worked with yogis, I've worked with popes. I've been really fortunate to work with both Pope Benedict the 16th and Pope Francis. And we did a few books together. My favorite is something called Dear Pope Francis, which is a children's book that we all did together. And then I also had the pleasure of working with Michael Singer, who wrote a book called The Untethered Soul. We worked on this book here called The Surrender Experiment, and worked with Leslie Kean. So if anyone has Netflix, this book, Surviving Death, which is about the afterlife, was made into a Netflix series. And so that's on currently right now. And so worked with Deepak, and then that red book on the right, you're right, is by Dean Radin. And that is a book on how human beings can become superheroes, essentially, which is really fun to do. And Dean Radin worked on the Stargate program. So, and the Stargate, we'll talk a little bit about it later, but it was for the time being in the late, in the 90s, it was a top secret government program where we're using, we're really trying to test psychic abilities and whether or not we could spy on Russia. It's actually, we'll learn a little bit more about that later. And then the most recent book I've worked on is A Diary of an American Exorcist by the chief exorcist of Washington, DC. So that's a real job, and he's a real person, and he has some amazing stories. And so I was a collaborator on this, and I'm also working as his agent. And so we're in talks right now to do a documentary series with Discovery Plus. So, and I'm also the author of this book, which is, I've written 7 books, but this is my favorite, which is Holy Ghost. And this is a memoir, but it's a book about a haunting that took place in our Rockville Center home, so not too far away from here, between 2007 and 2008. And just to tell you a little bit about those events, in March of 2007, a couple of days after my wife miscarried, we started experiencing some strange phenomena in the house. And in the beginning, you just kind of, explain it away as whatever, your imagination, stress. But what happened is the events started to build and build and build. And soon they were affecting my son, and they were affecting my wife as well. And so that started a whole journey for me to find out, what was going on in the house. It led me to doing a lot of research about the paranormal and the supernatural. And it led me to reach out to Marian Winkowski, who is the real life inspiration for the TV show The Ghost Whisperer. And she and I became friends in the process, and she helped me with my little ghost problem that we had in the house. And so right now I wrote a script for this, which is that we're very fortunate right now is being considered for a streaming service, and we'll see how that goes. But it's a fictionalized account of this book. So during the writing of that book, I did a lot of research on the supernatural, which I didn't know much about, and a lot of research on the paranormal and science. And my follow-up book was supposed to be something called The Supernatural History of the World, except as you'll see, there's a lot of information out there. And with 2 kids, I was like, you know what? I can't do this, it's too big. So after about 2 or 3 years of working on the book, I put it aside and wrote a few other books, but that book I may go back to now, and wanted to bring some of the research that I picked up and share it with others, because I think it is kind of fascinating, and I hope you find it's fascinating too. So a little bit about the supernatural, just a definition. the earliest use of supernatural comes from Thomas Aquinas. It's from Latin, called supernaturalus, which means above or beyond nature, something divine, so something from God. And so he uses that term for the first time in his work, the Summa Theologica, which summarizes his theological work in Christianity. But the term really doesn't start to get used until really about the 18th century, with the beginning of the Enlightenment. Because before that, there really is no division between natural and supernatural. There just is. And so when things happen, they're either part of God or they're part of somewhere else. But there wasn't this differentiation that we have now. You know, something is rational, something is irrational. There wasn't that division up until the beginning of the Enlightenment. And so as we've gone on from the 1700s, things have become much more divided. And so a lot of people really don't think that you can reconcile science and spirituality, science and religion. But having worked in the field for a number of years, you definitely can. And what I'd like to do in this talk is to expand the definition of the supernatural to really talk about human potential, right? And that's twofold. The human potential, so the first aspect of human potential that I see connecting to the supernatural is the potential for some part of us, our soul, our personality, our energy to survive bodily death. That's the first potential. Right, and then the second is for us to experience or to exhibit something extraordinary. So whether that's communication with the spirit world, magic, synchronicity, spontaneous healing, miracles, the work that I've done with all these authors over the last few years, you know, you realize that these people are honest and true people. And when they talk about spontaneous healings or they talk about miracles that they've experienced, if you were skeptical before, you become less skeptical as you listen to these people. And so what I'd like to do in the next kind of like 45 minutes is to try to go through 60,000 years of history. And we'll look at we'll trace the supernatural up until the present moment. It's a little heavy on the West, though I do include Asia and Africa and Australia as well. And I'm going to probably be skipping around a little bit because I used to do this presentation over the course of 3 days. Obviously, 60,000 years is a lot of time. So we're going to try to do this in 45 minutes. So if you see me skipping, it's not because it's not important. It's just I want to try and get to the end. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about ghosts. And if you see on the left, that's the lady in white, the famous lady in white, ghosts and apparitions. Right below that is something called a preta, which is it's a ghost that we find in Buddhism or in Hinduism. Really in India and in China, and the preta means the Sanskrit for hungry ghost. And so a hungry ghost would be someone who is greedy, someone who is evil in life, or did really, really bad things. And then in the afterlife, they are essentially damned to hunger for that which they loved or that which they coveted, I guess, in their real life, in their physical life. So if they were greedy, they may need to eat money. So if money disappears from someone's house, right, it's because the preta was eating it and needs to continuously fill itself, and it never is fulfilled. So very, very close to Dante's souls in hell and his inferno, who essentially get what they wanted in life. And if you did it in a bad way, then you suffer for it in the afterlife. And so next to that is a yokai, so a Japanese ghost. There was a TV show, if anyone has little kids, little grandkids, a few years ago, by the folks who did Pokemon. And it was a TV show about spirits called Yokai. And then Casper, who's greatly influenced my life. So he is a friendly ghost, and he's actually a major character in my book, Holy Ghost. And then supernatural includes demons. And so that book I showed before, which was Diary of an American Exorcist. I've studied demonology for the Archdiocese of Washington, D.C. There is actually a program. And Monsignor Rossetti, who's the author of that book, was a teacher. And so we spent months actually learning about the spirit world, about angels and demons, and just a few here. Pazuzu over here on the left is a dark angel of the winds. It's a Sumerian demon. And so if anyone who lives in the desert or has experienced the desert knows that the winds can be detrimental and deadly. And so I was talking to my wife the other day just about why are there no demons like in gardens or happy places, because they're happy places. But places like the desert, which can be deadly, you'll find a lot of demons, especially in Mesopotamian legend and folklore. Right below that is Lilitu, so another Sumerian demon, and she will. Anthropologists and archaeologists believe that she inspires the Hebrew legend of Lilith. Lilith being the first wife of Adam, and so Lilith is the stealer of children, the devourer of children, as is Moloch here on the right, and as is Lamashtu also here. And these are all Mesopotamian demons. There's Samanu, who's waving to you, but it's had his hand cut off. He is the demon of grain disease. So again, if there's anything that could go wrong in your life, there will be demons, at least in Mesopotamia and essentially in Greek folklore and in Asian folklore as well. So if there's a problem that could happen, whether there's demons for losing your hair, there's demons for cancers, there's demons for your house falling down. And so Samanu here is a demon of grain disease, and he comes from the old Babylonian period. And over here is Beelzebub on the right. So he is the Lord of the Flies, and he's first mentioned in the book of Philistine, or he's mentioned in the Old Testament and is worshipped by the Philistines, and then appears also in a much later text called the Testament of Solomon, which is written around the 10th century. But he is called the Prince of Demons in the New Testament as well. And I went a little demon happy. Sorry about that. A little demon crazy. That's Baphomet. He is supposedly the demon that the Knights Templar worshipped in the 1300s in the late 13th century, and which essentially had them deemed heretics and destroyed by the Catholic Church. And then the glyph we see here on the left is the name of Ahriman. And so Rudolf Steiner, if anyone knows the Waldorf schools, so Rudolf Steiner was the creator of the Waldorf schools. Here, he was a clairvoyant, and he wrote a lot about Ahriman. Ahriman being one of two demons that are essentially separating us from God. And he's also kind of an arch nemesis of people who belong to an order, a Catholic order called the Opus Sanctorum Angelorum. So and that's the work of the holy angels. So not really a secret organization, but an organization nonetheless that exists out there. And so the interesting about Ahriman is that he is seen by many, including Rudolf Steiner over 100 years ago, as a technology demon. So, and believe that he was what Ahriman was trying to do was to make people more computer-like and less human. And so anyone who's been addicted to social media, anyone who gets addicted to your streams, it could be that Rudolf Steiner was really a prophet about these sort of things. What if Ahriman is really influencing, what's going on in the world? And is Steve Jobs the devil? Maybe. I'll talk a little bit about divination, so the Ouija board, crystals, things like that. ESP, these are Xena cards. So if anyone has seen Ghostbusters, there's a scene in the very beginning where Bill Murray is giving a test to test ESP on a young woman. She's getting all the answers wrong, but he holds up these cards and she's supposed to guess what's on the other, or they look like regular facing cards on one end, and this is what you have to guess on the other side. So these were made popular by J.P. Ryan, who used them in tens of thousands of experiments in the early 20th century to test for ESP. And his conclusions are that ESP is real. I think anyone who's ever experienced synchronicity can also agree with that. We'll talk a little bit about UFOs if we have time. The UFOs, I was really fortunate when I was writing Holy Ghost to, after that book was done, it was shared with Whitley Strieber, who wrote a book called Communion. And so Communion was really one of the first books that talked about alien abduction. And that was written in 1985, and he was living up in the Hudson Valley when supposedly he was abducted by the Greys. And so the Greys are the aliens, gray skin, big eyes. They've been depicted in South Park. So that very first episode of South Park, Janine, you might know this, that whole episode is based on Whitley Strieber. And but when he and I were talking, like I'd never read his book before. And then when I did finally go back and read Communion after I'd written my book, the way that he describes alien encounters or encounters with these Greys was almost identical to the way I was writing about my encounters with ghosts. And so he and I have talked over the years about what's really going on. You know, are people who supposedly have encounters with UFOs or extraterrestrials having ghostly encounters, or people who are having ghostly encounters, encountering something else that's a little otherworldly? And there's lots to explore there. But yeah, Whitley Strieber has been a huge influence on some of the work that I've been doing. And then just that's a 15th century painting right there, Italian painting, which is the Annunciation of the Virgin Mary. And if you look up it's tough to see up there, but in the upper left, there is something that looks very familiar. It looks very much like that UFO that we see on the left. And we won't talk about ancient aliens, but and if you actually look closer at that image, you'll see that it's really not a UFO, but it's a circle of angels. So, but that's what the artist depicted. So could it be that when people see UFOs or flying saucers, they're actually seeing an angelic encounter? A lot of people think so, and truly like fascinating. But it's also a topic where you can go down a rabbit hole very easily. Spirit photography. So this is an image from the late 19th century. And so anyone who's interested in spirit photography, looking at it from a 21st century mind, it looks faked, and most of it might be. Yeah, but there are some interesting images. This is one that people feel like there was something going on there, that they really weren't able to fake that one, or that one was not faked. And then to the right are orbs. So when digital cameras started to come out, orbs became a very big thing because they started popping up in a lot of photographs. And so spirit photography still exists to this day. So even though, yeah, so, and I was in Auschwitz in 1997, and I took photos of a firing wall where people were lined up and they were executed. And that was that, and then 2 other areas. The rest of the film was fine, but those 3 photos, spots and blotches all over. An anomaly could be. I mean, it went through X-ray, you know, at the airports, but so did all my other film. That was the only roll of film that was affected. And the 3 pictures were in spots where numerous people had been killed. So, and then maybe we'll talk a little bit about Bill Murray and ectoplasm. So we slime. Love Bill. All right, so beginning kind of our journey at 60,000 BCE, so BCE being before the Common Era, there's evidence that Neanderthals, who are our distant relatives, all of us might have, anyone who's from European descent probably has 0.05, 0.1% to 1% of Neanderthal in them. And so we, Homo sapiens, who we are, and Neanderthals shared a common ancestor. We don't know who that common ancestor is, really. There's a lot of debate about that. But 60,000 years ago, Neanderthal began to bury their dead with flowers. So was it a symbolic gesture? Was it was there some kind of religious element to it? Did they believe that because the body may have smelled, that it was a way of just kind of perfuming the body? Or was it a way of giving someone something beautiful as they journeyed into the afterlife? We don't know, but it is the very first time that we see ritualistic burial. And that's from the Neanderthal. And again, going back to this whole thing of like what happens to us after we die. In 25,000 BC in Russia, archaeologists discovered this body that was covered with all of this jewelry. And again, we don't really know why this was done, but we do know that later on, when the Egyptians are burying their dead, we may think in modern times you can't take it with you when you go, but the Egyptians thought differently. And it seems to be that early Homo sapiens, believe that you could take something with you when you died. Again, conjecture, but a lot of really smart people have looked at this and come to that conclusion, that it could be that. In 15,000 BCE, well, in 1940, actually, there was a young man who was in southern France who was out with his dog, and his dog fell down a hole near a cave or near a cave system. And so he went with his friends to get help and to get his dog out. And so they dropped down into this cave that you see here on the right with flashlights. And what they discovered was a major archaeological discovery, which are the cave paintings of Lascaux. And you can see them here at just one here, but they're massive. That picture right there with the bison, that might be 15 feet tall. And so the reason why I include this particular image is that many anthropologists and archaeologists believe that the Birdman that you kind of see here, you might not see it but you see it over here right next to the bison. There's a Birdman, and next to him seems to be a staff, right? A staff with a bird on it. And that their thinking is that this is the shaman, and that what we're seeing is kind of a vision quest, or possibly a journey to become this animal, or a journey with the animal into the afterlife. So shaman were holy men. We know that now, and dating, and then kind of reversing it, we believe that, at least on this painting here, that this shaman was experiencing either some kind of supernatural event, or at least that's what was depicted here on the wall. And just some more pictures of the folks from Lascaux. There's the dog, his name is Robot. Okay, in 10,000 BCE, Australian Aborigines begin to develop a supernatural framework for how the world is created, right? And so it's mythology, but it's more than a mythology, because they really did believe that their ancestors were part of these spirits that created, well, they created the trees, and they created the rocks, and they created the mountains, and they created the plains. And these were relatives. And so it really is kind of the beginning of this, the development of an idea of a supernatural world and how it relates to ancestors. In 10,000 BCE, we see the beginnings of something called Vodun, which is a practice that eventually it starts out in East Africa, in Egypt and Mesopotamia, and then moves west, and will eventually make its way right to the western side of Africa. And then those practitioners will be enslaved and brought to North and South America. But our anthropologists have seen that around this time, and archaeologists as well, was the development of the idea that spirits could embody another person, that you could call upon the spirits, that you could enter into something magical, for lack of a better word, and then embody. That spirit would then possess a person, and that would sometimes heal a person. So you would do a ritual to try and have spirits enter somebody in order to heal someone of a disease or an injury. Or you could have a spirit go into someone, possess that person, and then wreak havoc on an enemy. 7,000 BCE in Turkey, in Çatalhöyük, we see really concrete evidence of ancestral worship. And so there are temples. That was really the first temples were built about 7,000 BCE. And so there was definitely worship going on. And also in that community, people were living with their dead relatives. And so what they would do is that they would bury them under their homes. And so you can see that on the left, essentially people would be buried under these huts or these small houses. They would be covered over with reeds. And, you know, if your grandparent had passed away, that grandparent was with you all the time. And that grandparent could then help you organize your home, could help protect your home, was still a member of the family. And on the right, you'll just see a skeleton that they found in Chattahayuk, and it's missing its head, right? So it was a vertebrae that kind of almost looked like a head right there, but it's missing its head because at the same time too was the development of skull cults, because they believed that the skull held supernatural powers. And so they would cut the heads off, but they replaced the bodies. And so we're thinking that they decorated their homes with the skulls. We'll do a quick run here. Like in 6500 BCE, the medicine men start drilling holes in skulls to release evil spirits. Sounds macabre, except that we were doing something similar with epileptic patients back in the middle of the 20th century with lobotomies. So in 3000 BCE, Newgrange is developed, and this is a burial mound, kind of an Irish version of a pyramid. In 2552 is the Chinese begin developing what will become the I Ching, which is a philosophical text, but also used for divination. And so those sticks there, essentially I Ching would use these sticks, and there's a pattern of breaking them out or throwing them, and however they land would correspond to a hexagram. And then you'd be able to use that, however that hexagram aligned with that particular, with the particular formation of the sticks, you would be able to think about something, right? Or think about something very deeply through this philosophical text, but really to try and predict your future. And so kings used it, and it was also used by the poor as well. In around 2500 BCE, we have the development of pyramids. And so here the Egyptians create these massive monuments to the afterlife. And so pharaohs would be buried with all their goods, gold. I mean, King Tut, if anyone has seen like all the treasures that came out of King Tut, and he wasn't even relatively speaking, not a major king. It was just amazing. And so the Egyptians believed that you could take this stuff with you into the afterlife. And then around 1550 BCE, we see the development of something called the Book of the Dead, which are funerary texts. And so you would papyrus or stones that were drawn on or crafted would then be placed in a tomb or placed in someone's sarcophagus so that it would help the person move into the afterlife. And so we have this is actually a page that's been restored, but a page from the Book of the Dead. And so we don't have a complete Book of the Dead, but they pieced together different parts of them. And so it wasn't just one Book of the Dead. So if you died, your family might have a certain funerary text or book of spells or scroll of spells that you would put in the coffin, the sarcophagus, for the person to take with them to the afterlife. And then this is just kind of a more detailed scene of what is called the weighing of the heart. And so on the left, there is a heart on the scale, and this is Hunifer's heart, who lived around 1275 BCE. And what would happen is, at least what we see here in this depiction, is that a feather would be placed on the other side of the scale. And if someone had a light heart, they would balance themselves out, and that person would then go on to the afterlife, to a place called Sekhat Awul, which is the field of reeds, which is a happy place in Egypt. And if not, if your heart was heavy, if it was dark, if it was tainted or diseased because of the type of things you did while you were alive, the scales would go out of balance and you would be devoured by this monster here that is part crocodile, part lion, and part human being. And that's called a myth.
Is that your life story written on that?
Essentially, yeah. And so on the right is thought. So or thought. So he'll show up a little bit later on and become part of the embodiment of Hermes Trismegistus, who is supposedly a scribe, holy man who wrote numerous texts that became the Hermetica, or the Corpus Hermetica. And so your life is basically being inscribed here by Thoth. He is taking down the minutes of your life, literally down to the very last minute, on the decision of whether or not you go into the afterlife or you're torn to pieces. Let's skip this. Around 900 BCE, Sumerians are using talismans, and this seems to be the first instance of talismans being used against ghosts, or something that they call the Gadim. And so Gadim, again, were these restless spirits, essentially that they were created at the time of death. So it wasn't necessarily a person's soul, but if someone was kind of a tragic person, that tragedy, that dark energy would create this thing called the Gadim. And these Gadim would haunt folks. And so they would use talismans, very much like we would do today in Catholicism. You might use a St. Benedict medal or a cross. In Judaism and Islam, you might use, I'm forgetting the name of it, but it's to help ward off the evil eye. If anyone's married to an Italian, you know a lot about the evil eye. I'm married to an Italian, and they talk about the evil eye all the time. And but there are talismans, and to this day, people still use talismans. And the funny thing is, not every language has a name for a bathroom, right? Or there isn't a word for bathroom. Every language has a word for the evil eye. So in every culture out there, the evil eye, which we may think is superstitious, exists. And if you look at the stuff of Dean Radin's work, he won't call it the evil eye, but the ability for thoughts to influence other people seems to be a very, very real thing. Okay. In 750 BCE, we have the Oracle of Delphi. And so this is really the first trance medium that we know of in history. And so the interesting thing is most mediums, not everybody, George Anderson, who I've worked with, is a man, but most mediums are women. And throughout history, women seem to have had they are much more open to spiritual experience. So men a lot of times get all the credit. But this in Greece, about 750 BCE, what would happen is, this is Pythia, and so she was a priestess of Apollo, and then she would basically go into this crack or this cave. She would sit on this tripod, and there would be cracks in the cave, and there would be fumes that were coming up, and she would go into a trance. And so a rich person, a king may come, or a diplomat may come and ask her questions. She would essentially speak in tongues, and there would be someone there to write that down or to interpret, and that person would interpret what she was experiencing. And the interesting thing about the Oracle of Delphi is that it didn't matter if you were rich or poor. You could be rich or you could be poor, and you could still get an appointment to see Pythia. In 500 BCE, this is interesting, in the second book of Kings in the Hebrew Bible, Elisha is a prophet, and he actually spies on the king of Syria psychically. So he's able to kind of go into a trance-like state. And this may be the very first instance of remote viewing. And so remote viewing was core in the Stargate program that took place in the late 1970s. We'll talk about it a little bit later if we have time. But that was kind of interesting. And then Plato in 380 BC, at least in the West, it's the first discussion of reincarnation, and that appears in the Republic. Okay. In 172 BCE, there's an ibis cult, and so there's a big bird cult. And we know this, well, one of the cults records this name, Trismegistus, or thrice great, right? And this is a reference to Hermes Trismegistus, who, if we remember, thought before, will become core for this body of work that is really kind of a spell book, a book of philosophy called the Corpus Hermetica. And Hermes Trismegistus, or thought, will kind of line up with Hermes from the Greek pantheon and become this kind of syncretic, godlike person, Hermes Trismegistus. And so that spell book will become very, very instrumental in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And there's Hermes, so again, thought there, Hermes on the right, and he's a syncretic. Well, it seems to be that a lot of people think he's a made-up person, but there's more and more evidence to suggest that he may have lived. In 4 BCE, Jesus Christ was born. It was a virgin birth, pretty supernatural. In the year 30 of the Common Era, he begins performing miracles, Jesus does. And one of the first things he does is cast out demons. And then a few years later, he is crucified and is resurrected. Right? And then his followers, after that, experience kind of a spiritual awakening, and then can speak in tongues and also perform miracles. In 43, in the year 43, the Romans invade Britain, and they bring with them the festival of Pomona. And so that was really their fall festival, so their harvest festival, and that begins to again kind of combine with a Celtic celebration of Samhain, and eventually that will lead to what we know as Halloween. Right, and so Samhain was really just a pagan, was the Celts' pagan festival where they would celebrate the end of the harvest, but also the beginning of winter. And so it took place on October 31st and November 1st. And strangely enough, Pomona did as well, right around that same time. Which I always find interesting, that two cultures could know nothing about each other for a while, but actually be doing the same thing. In the year 90, we have maybe the first story of a haunted house. And this is by someone named Pliny the Younger. His uncle was Pliny the Elder. But Pliny the Younger was a Greek letter writer. So I guess he's kind of like a blogger today. And so I guess he was writing the equivalent of blogs back in 90. And he records the story about a philosopher named Athenodorus. And so in this story, Athenodorus kind of moves to this town. He's looking for a place to live. He finds a place that is relatively cheap. It's a nice place, and he gets a little suspicious, like, why is this place so cheap? And then one night he's writing a book, or he's doing some writing, and a ghost comes to him in the middle of the night and interrupts him, and is like, he's got chains on, he's howling, and Athenodorus is not frightened. He's like, dude, I'm writing. Wait till I'm done. And so once Athenodorus finishes, he's got a waiting ghost there. He tries to listen to what the ghost has to say. He can't really communicate, but he does point outside. And so eventually Athenodorus and the ghost go outside, chains are rattling, and then the ghost disappears at a certain spot. Athenodorus intuitively thinks that maybe this is the spirit of a man who has not had a proper burial. They dig him up. Well, they dig in that area. Turns out there is a skeleton of an old man, and he's bound with chains. And then they give him a proper burial, and he's never heard of again. And so I'm pretty sure that Charles Dickens knew about the story. But the idea of like bounding someone with chains when they die so they can't resurrect is probably pretty common. Dickens uses it in The Christmas Carol for Jacob Marley, but this really is probably the first time we encounter a haunted house or a haunted abode, someplace where someone lives. 250, in the year 250, Teotihuacan is completed. So this is a temple in Mexico, probably Mayan, but they're not 100% sure. And so there were a lot of sacrifices that were going on at that time with jaguar, cougar, and eagles. And you did this all this sacrifice was not necessarily to appease the god, but to embody the actual creature that you were killing, and to take on its qualities, which isn't really too far off from like Christianity. Christians or Catholics in particular, they'll celebrate the feast of the communion of the Eucharist, and they take a little bit of the body of Jesus into their bodies, and so that they can become more like him. Okay, in 312, Roman Emperor Constantine has a vision to place a Christian cross on his shields. He's going to be battling a guy named Maxentius, which is his arch nemesis. And this becomes the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. Constantine wins after having this vision of Jesus and this vision of putting the cross on shields. And this marks the beginning of the Roman Empire's conversion to Christianity, and which really changes the world. And at that, few years later, Christianity is growing in popularity, and things like numerology and divination are banned by the Council of Nicaea. And so the Council of Nicaea was a way of trying to address a number of heresies that were springing up about Christianity. A few years later, in India, Tantra is being developed. And so Tantra is essentially a way of developing supernatural powers through meditation and certain physical exercises that's still kind of practiced today. A few years later, in the year 400, the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali is collected into book form. Now, it's possible that those writings have been around for 1,500, maybe 2,000 years prior. But this book talks about something called the cities. And so basically, it's the sutras are these thoughts that you think about when you practice yoga. And so the belief system of yoga is collected in this book. But it does talk about the cities, and the cities are the outcome of intense meditation, and which can lead to levitation, which can lead to visions, which can lead to predicting the future, which can lead to healing other people and healing yourself, and people having spontaneous healing. And Dean Radin, who worked on Stargate, worked on a book called Supernormal, which explored the cities to see whether or not they are actually true, if they're true. In 410, St. Augustine writes a City of God. And it's actually the story, it's the first time we see something that looks like a poltergeist. So there's a house in town that Augustine writes about, where he believes that there is an evil spirit in the house, and it's throwing things and destroying things in the house. They don't see a spirit. People have fled, but there's crazy paranormal or supernatural experiences going on, a lot of destruction going on. And so poltergeist is a German word for polter, meaning noisy, geist meaning spirit. And we'll see them a little bit later on, but this really is in history the first time that we hear about a poltergeist, which is very odd because for Augustine, St. Augustine, who is one of the doctors of Christianity, to talk about something like that, he's a pretty rational guy in his writings. So for him to talk about that, it's interesting. He doesn't talk anything about ghosts except for this one passage. All right, 610, Muhammad has visions, which will has supernatural visions, which will ultimately lead to the foundation or the forming of Islam. In 735 CE, Pope Gregory III converts Samhain into All Saints' Day. And so the eve of All Saints' Day will become All Hallows' Eve, hallow meaning holy. And yeah, so that's where there's a very complicated and wonderful history of Halloween. But Pope Gregory's, the Pope Gregory's there in the right, and lots of witches there. Kabbalah is developed, or really developed over 1,000 years, but kind of culminated here. And so the teachings, the Jewish teachings, or the rabbinical Judaic teachings of a supernatural, of the supernatural is really kind of collected. Let's see. In 1347, we have the Black Death. So the Black Death itself is not a supernatural experience. One of the worst pandemics of all time. 1/3 of Europe is wiped out. But what this did is, because there was so much mass death, it really people started to question what their beliefs were, and really believe that they were being punished by evil spirits, and that the dead could come back and rise again. So there was a lot of calamity, both physically but spiritually and mentally, that was going on. And once you experience, or a country or a part of the world experiences such death, it makes you question your faith. And so we will start to see cracks in Christianity, which is the leading religion, at least in the West. We'll see a big crack in 1517 with the Reformation, but it's really, I would say, here starts the fracturing of the Catholic Church and its power in Europe. Because if God is supposed to be good, how can he allow such massive death to happen? Okay, Catholic Church starts to break. So in 1442, we had first evidence of tarot cards. So they've been around for, almost 600 years. And they look a little bit like that, but this is a Visconti Sforza tarot deck. If you go to the Morgan Library here in New York City, they have some of these. So we don't have a full tarot deck, but they have many of them here in the Morgan Library. So really, really interesting, interesting designs. There's death on the left, there's a fool on the right, and these other kind of trump cards in the middle. And so there was a lot of belief for many years that tarot cards go back to Egyptian times. There really is very little evidence that is the case. They seem to have been a deck of playing cards for a strategy game called Tarocco that was played in Italy, but kind of like the Egyptian deck better. In 1460, the Corpus Hermetica is collected. So these are 17 spiritual works supposedly by Hermes Trismegistus. This will influence the rise of the resurgence of Wiccan later on. Will also influence ceremonial magic, New Thought that happens in the late 19th century, in the 20th century. New Thought being, if anyone has ever read The Secret, that is really kind of a New Thought text. And Hermes Trismegistus is still, there's kind of in these kind of spirituality, supernatural, occult, paranormal worlds, he's still very much an interesting character and someone that people are still exploring to this day. In 1484, we had the development of something called the Malleus Maleficarum, which translates into the hammer of witches. And so this was created by 2 Dominican priests, essentially to combat witchcraft in Europe. And it's a reaction to Exodus 22:18, you shall not suffer a witch to live, or sorceress. They didn't use the word witch, but it's been translated to witch in time. And essentially this text, it's a text on witchcraft, it's a text on demonology, it's a text on, just theology, will be used for nearly 300 years, not just in the Catholic Church, but also in Protestant sects as well, and will lead to, a lot of bad things that happen to people in that time. Most notably for us here in the United States, the Salem witch trials. Okay. 1531, Juan Diego has a vision of the Virgin Mary, and it's Our Lady of Guadalupe. So he sees Mary on a hill, brings her flowers, and then puts them in this kind of shawl he's wearing, or this poncho, and then takes them back to his church in that area, or to the people in that area. He unfolds all the roses that are sitting on his clothes, and the Virgin Mary's face on that piece of fabric. So anyway, there's a huge devotion to Our Lady of Guadalupe, especially in Mexico and South America. And essentially, when people would pray to her for miracles. And then 1555, Prophecies of Nostradamus is published. I remember growing up, I watched an episode of In Search of, where they talked about the prophecies of Nostradamus, and it ends with like a nuclear attack on New York or something, and I literally for a year couldn't see. It was the worst. To this day, I can see that image, just that flash. Okay, 1556, All Hallows Eve is first recorded in the English language. In 1558, Mary Queen of Scots dies, Queen Elizabeth ascends the throne, and John Dee becomes her primary astrologer. And John Dee predicted that she would take the throne. And so he essentially lives out his life as Queen Elizabeth's court astrologer. And then Teresa of Avila publishes Interior Castle. She is a Catholic nun, and chronicles divine ecstasies that she has with God and miracles. And she was also known to levitate during prayer. So she would go into these ecstatic trances. 1692, we have the Salem witch trials, but also in that same year, in Hartford, Connecticut, there was another witch scare, and at the center of this was a young woman named Kate Branch, a teenager who seemed to be afflicted by dark spirits and accused a number of townsfolk of bewitching her, and essentially these were the enemies of her family. No one died from this, I don't think. I'm pretty sure no one died. But it seems that information about the Salem witch trial had traveled to surrounding areas. Within that year, there were a number of witch trials and witch scares in Massachusetts, New England area. And then we just see a way of, again, this comes out of Malleus Maleficarum, a way of, let's see, if we can try to drown a witch, if she doesn't drown, then she's a witch. And if she drowns, she's not a witch. So you're kind of screwed if you do, screwed if you don't. Their thinking is if she is someone who's not a witch, then her soul goes on to heaven. Kind of incredibly cruel and nasty. 1744, we have Emanuel Swedenborg. He writes something called the Journal of Dreams. He is, you could say he's a trance medium. He has a number of visions. One of the visions he has happened in 1759, where he's at a dinner party and he has this flash, this insight that Stockholm is going up in flames and is burning down. And that city is 300 miles away. 3 days later, news arrives that he was correct, that Stockholm had gone up in flames. In 1765, Franz Anton Mesmer uses magnets to hypnotize, or he really kind of creates this idea of hypnotism and uses magnets to try to mesmerize. So that word mesmerize comes from mesmer. William Blake was a visionary, was very influenced by Emanuel Swedenborg, and he would often paint his visions. So he would, and he was commissioned to paint these paintings for Bibles and things like that. But he would draw all of this from the visions that he had when he would go into these meditative states. And so anyone who's ever read The Red Dragon by Tom Harris, the picture on the left is featured in that book. In 1817, so we jump a little bit to 1817, we have the story of John Bell in Tennessee, which becomes, this is a famous poltergeist witch story that becomes known as the Bell Witch legend. And it really is probably one of the better known ghost stories, at least up until the 20th century. And so John Bell is in his fields when he has this strange encounter with a black dog. So when Led Zeppelin, sings about a black dog, they're singing about a demonic dog that appeared. And after that, all hell breaks loose in his house. And so things start flying all over the place. He hears strange voices, disembodied voices begin talking to him and saying horrible things to him and his family. And the Bell Witch seems to focus on his young daughter. Eventually, the witch is banished and said that she would return. And was lots of legends about whether or not she actually did it. So is this legend, is this true? It's written as if it's true. There are certainly lots of eyewitnesses. And it piqued so many people's interest. It even piqued Andrew Jackson, who would become president of the United States, and he went off to investigate himself. In 1820, Legend of Sleepy Hollow is written by Washington Irving. So this is a short story. It's fictionalized. It's fiction, but it is a story about ghosts and spirits. But the one thing that's always stuck out with me is that within the first 2 or 3 pages, Washington Irving notes that the Hudson Valley is known for strange lights in the sky, strange sights in the sky. And so the Hudson Valley is supposedly the biggest UFO hotspot in America. Thousands and thousands of sightings that happen, strange sightings. And that's where Whitley Strieber lived when he experienced that encounter with UFOs. Which I still to this day find fascinating that Irving makes this little note that I think a lot of people miss, but really does talk. And anyone who's ever been out to the Hudson Valley, it's beautiful. There's something odd about it. In the 19th century, we have the burned over district develops in Western New York. And essentially this becomes, New York really became a hotbed for spiritual revival. So Seventh-day Adventists are develops out in this area, as does Mormonism. And in 1823, in that year, the angel Moroni visited not St. Joseph, but Joseph Smith, who was a young clairvoyant. So the founder of Mormonism used to do scrying with mirrors and used to tell people's fortunes with mirrors. And so he was a young clairvoyant. And the angel led him to a number of golden plates that were hidden in upstate. And a few years later, he translated these and it became the Book of Mormon. And so Joseph Smith did have these kind of visionary experiences. So we're at 7:30. So we're almost at the hour. And so I think we're on until 7:30. I'm going to keep going. Obviously, if you guys have to go, totally cool. And I know they shut down here at 8 o'clock, but I'll try to whip through some of this quickly. In 1846, Daniel Home he's a young boy at the time, but he has strange knocking or experiences strange knockings and rappings in his home in Connecticut. He will end up becoming one of the most famous mediums that exist in the 19th century. And that image of him on the left, supposedly in front of many, many people, he was able to levitate out a window and then come back. Whether or not it was chicanery or it was real, we never know, except there seemed to be a number of prominent eyewitnesses that saw the event and believe that it did. In 1848, a few years later, spiritualism develops in Hydesville, New York. Right, so not exactly in the burnt over district, but near it. And so it begins with Kate and Margaret Fox, who begin hearing these kind of strange scratching noises outside their home, and then knocks. And then they start talking to whatever it is that they're hearing, and they start having a conversation through knocks. And so they'll ask, are you a dead person? Knock once for yes, 2 for no. That would be 1 knock. And they would ask these series of questions. In the beginning, they believed it, even their parents thought it was they were just playing around or creating some kind of, there was some kind of game that they were doing. But this kept going on and on. And then strange things began to happen in the house as well. And there were noises and more knocks. And then neighbors started to come from far and wide to actually experience these things. They got so bad that they sent the Fox sisters away about 30 miles to be with their sister Leah. And whether it was real or not, Leah found an opportunity to make some money. And so the girls went essentially on tour and were able to contact spirits. And years later, both women said that they lied. But the story is complicated because they were poor and destitute at that point, and materialists were paying them to say that they lied. And so they were kind of at the end of their rope, and they took money in order to recant everything that happened. But it's hard to say whether or not they really lied or if they were just under duress and took money. Regardless, it begins what comes to be known as spiritualism, which is a huge 19th century social and religious movement. It's very much connected to mesmerism, hypnotism, again, trances. And it also, so what you start seeing is that there are a number of women who start to gather together and perform seances and also try to communicate with spirits. And then and so what happens is more and more women are getting together, more and more women are talking, and it really does influence the women's suffrage movement. And so Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who is the president of the National Women's Suffrage Association, she was a spiritualist. Victoria Woodhull, who was the first woman candidate for the US presidency, was a spiritualist. And she actually ran for the presidency with Frederick Douglass, but never told him. So he was kind of shocked to learn that he was on the ballot. And then Harriet Beecher Stowe was also a spiritualist and a suffragist and an abolitionist, and she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. Okay, cool. 15 minutes left. Okay, seances. Put your hands together. Try to bring spirits into the room. Scary stuff. I don't want to do it, but I've known a lot of people who have done it, and they've had strange experiences. And some people have had no experiences whatsoever. Table tipping, that came out of spiritualism as well. So you would put your fingers on a small table, and somehow the table would levitate. Is this mind over matter? Is it spirits? Is it a fraud? Hard to say. Leslie Kean, who again, I believe, she's an author I worked with, really smart woman. She's experienced it. She doesn't think it's fraud. Out of that, more divination rises out of spiritualism, and the talking board becomes a really powerful instrument for divination and something that a lot of people begin using. And so spirit boards are essentially what we have today as a Ouija board. And in 1892, William Fuld, who is a capitalist true and true, so a great way to make money, and he patented the Ouija board. And essentially that talking board from back then is what we have today, is a Ouija board. So it's slight variations, but it's pretty close to what it is. And in order to get a patent, you have to prove that something works. And so Fuld actually went down to the patent office, worked with the patent officer on the Ouija board, was able to answer and like spell out all of these things about that man's life, which freaked him out, and he gave him the patent that day. That's how the story goes. So Ouija boards are around, they're interesting, but they really take off after World War I. And that's because so many people died in that war, and people wanted to contact their loved ones. And you do see that spiritualism also kind of like comes to the forefront. It begins in 1848, around 1850, but it really like takes off after the Civil War, because 750 people die in that war, over 2 million casualties. People's lives are changed forever, and people want to communicate with the people that they lost. And so you'll see again a rise in the sort of like wanting to contact spirits that happens after any kind of like deadly encounter. So it happened here a little bit after 9/11, but it happened quite a bit after World War II. There was kind of a resurgence in the 50s. 1858, Virgin Mary appears to Bernadette Soubrio in the Pyrenees. This becomes Our Lady of Lourdes in Lourdes, France. This is where many people go to try and be healed, to try to find a miracle of healing for physical and mental ailments. 1862, Charles Dickens and Conan Doyle, they formed something called the Ghost Club, which is really, they're the original Ghostbusters. And so they would kind of go in search of houses that were haunted, and also kind of get together, kick back a few, and then talk about the supernatural world. This leads to the development of the Society for Psychical Research, which is founded in 1882. And they did a lot of studies. Frederick Meyer over here did something called Phantasms of the Living, which is thousands, like almost 2,000 pages of recorded of people he investigated and people he interviewed who had communications with people who had died. And a lot of, in that book, there's a lot of these examples of people who wake up in the middle of the night because someone has died, and then and then it happens, and it turns out that that person actually did die. There's a lot of that he chronicles in there. So it's mediums. Obviously, mediums start to spring up. These are three of the most popular. Spirit photography. That's ectoplasm. Okay, spirit photography. Arthur Conan Doyle was huge into spiritualism. He was big into spiritual photography. There he is, right there. It seems to be a spirit over his eyes. This is ectoplasm. Sort of Bill Murray kind of slimed before by ectoplasm, but this is spirit photographers' interpreting or recording, I should say, of ectoplasm. And that looks to be Arthur Conan Doyle's face and what could be a napkin or ectoplasm coming out of some of these notes. There's Arthur Conan Doyle again, and Arthur Conan Doyle is the originator and the creator of Sherlock Holmes. He was a big fan of, or a big believer in the Cottingley Fairies, which was a series of photographs that were taken in a London garden or outside London. And these were a huge rage, and he was a huge proponent that these fairies, and believe what you would like, truly existed. I'm not saying that they didn't, but they do look like paper dolls. Jumping a little bit, J.B. Ryan was one of the first, was a scientist, he was a botanist, but he founded the parapsychology lab at Duke University. In the early 20th century, parapsychology was actually well respected. People were donating lots of money in order for universities to investigate ESP. And so he did tens of thousands of tests. Essentially his findings, which can be contested, of course, but his findings suggest that ESP is real. That's his wife. Xena cards, Bill. More Xena cards. These were two of the guys who scored the hardest, the highest. Adam Linsmeyer and Hubert Pierce. Okay, poltergeist is a noisy spirit. We talked about that before. Quickly, just the Seaford poltergeist. And so here in Seaford, New York, on February 1958, there was a series of incidences that happened in the Harriman family. Essentially what happened, they came home and they found that all of their bottles in their house were popping spontaneously. And so their bleach bottle would shoot up in the air, their Coke bottle was, their milk bottle was exploding inside the refrigerator. And there's stuff everywhere. In the beginning, they thought it was just a prank, but it continued to happen. Every time they would bring a bottle into the house, the bottle would pop off. Not only that, but they would start to hear more strange sounds. Things would start flying around the room. And eventually they brought in the cops. You could read this on newsday.com or their archives, because it is covered. It's covered in the New York Times as well. Joe Tozzi was a very well-respected cop who witnessed these incidents. And J.B. Ryan actually sent some investigators, and they believe, and they all leave going, we have no idea how this was done. They seem to believe that maybe the theory comes out of this, that it could be that this young Jimmy, who was 13 years old, was so filled with angst that psychically that he was able to do this. And so that's become kind of a big theory about poltergeists. That poltergeists are not spirits at all, but kind of vent, like this energy that gets so vented up and then just kind of explodes. And it usually happens because of the adolescent. So anyone who's ever had a teenager in the house knows that they got some really bad energy sometimes. Okay, The Exorcist happens in 1973, the movie, but it's based on an actual event that happened in 1949 called the St. Louis exorcism. So it begins actually, the exorcism, or the story begins in Maryland when a young boy named Roland Doe, we don't know his real name, his aunt dies. They had played with a Ouija board numerous times, and after she dies, again, rappings, knockings, weird things start happening in the house, weird smells. His bed starts to move. He starts to get these imprints all over his body. And so they take the kid to a Presbyterian priest. He's like, I got nothing on this. You got to talk to Catholic. And so he has a friend who's a Catholic priest who investigates, thinks it could be demonic possession or demonic infestation in the house. And then basically they go back and forth between Maryland, Georgetown, St. Louis. St. Louis is the home where the final exorcism happens. It's a cousin's house. And eventually the boy is exorcised and went on to live a very happy and productive life. And I believe he's still alive. But we don't know his name. I think I know who it is. And so The Exorcist was based on that. And then I guess lastly, just Amityville Horror. Probably gosh, a disaster, because I really do think something happened at Amityville Horror, but it's been so marred by bad investigating and kind of lies that it's hard to separate truth from fiction on this one. And just too many people involved. But the November 13th, Ronnie DeFeo shot up his family, killed his mother and father, 2 sisters, 2 brothers, was arrested, never claimed in those early days that the devil made him do it. They tried to get him off on insanity. But 13 months later, George and Kathy Lutz move in. Shortly thereafter, they start to have strange smells in the house. Cabinets start slamming, they hear strange knocking, things begin to ooze out of walls. And eventually 28 days later, they can't take it anymore. They're seeing demonic eyes, they're seeing a strange pig figure, and they leave. And they leave all their stuff behind. And so over the years, people have thought, well, it's completely, it's all, they just tried to do it to do money. But if you really kind of investigate like what happened afterwards, I really don't think that they were interested in money at the time, or that this was a fraud in their case. I think something really strange happened, and then they got involved with the wrong people who essentially inflated the story. And so it's hard to figure out like what exactly happened. But they did take lie detector tests in both backs. UFOs, 1947, Ken Arnold is flying in Washington State, and I see something that he said looked like a saucer spinning or like skimming across the sky. A few days later, there's a supposed crash in Roswell, New Mexico. And at least within the first 24 hours, the government says that a flying saucer they confirmed that a flying saucer had crashed in Roswell, and then they changed their story 24 hours later. They said it's a weather balloon, and that's your weather balloon right there. 1978, Stargate, really fascinating. You should just Google it. The United States was trying to do psychic warfare against the Russians. Eventually, they end the program in 1991, but there's really a number of really interesting cases, especially the one with Pat Price, where he was able to be given coordinates and was able to see what the Russians were building in this area, kind of in this remote area. So we got 2 minutes for questions. So that's kind of it. So it's kind of 60,000 years and a little over 60 minutes. So, anyone have any questions or anything? Yeah.
Here's a question. Is there any way for any of us to either see more detail on this?
Yeah, if you go to GaryJansen.com, just I'll be happy to send this to you too, and I can send you links and all that. But I'd be happy to do that.
Great.
Yeah.
Excellent presentation, by the way.
Thanks, man. Cool. Thank you.
I feel like there's just so much there.
There's a lot, and I know it's probably a lot to inundate people with, but I feel like we live in a very materialist society right now that kind of debunks a lot of things, and they should debunk. Look, science should say if something's BS, it's BS. But I think especially in the last 10 years, we're really throwing the baby out with the bathwater, and that we're losing a huge part of who we are, right? And that's kind of connected to our soul and to spirits and to what I believe is a supernatural. You can call it the paranormal. I'm a person of faith, so I use the word supernatural because I do believe that there is evidence that we survive bodily death. You can call it paranormal if you don't like that word supernatural, but it's the reason why I wrote Holy Ghost too, which is just to say, hey, you know what? I wasn't a big believer in this stuff, but then you have these encounters and you're like, wait a minute. I don't think I'm crazy. I could be. But those incidents lasted a full year and then they didn't happen. So either I was crazy for a full year or something really odd and strange and extraordinary was going on.
You're still living in the same house?
Yeah. And so,
Are you still seeing things?
no, but funny enough, we've had strange experiences afterwards. Not as strange and very less frequent. And so, and I always question too, like, well, wait, maybe I'm just kind of reading into that. But yeah, there have been strange things that have happened, especially when my son was younger. When my youngest son was, he would say that he pointed to a man in the corner.
That didn't scare you?
Yeah, most things.
Only because it's just,
Yeah.
child,
The thing is, he was never scared, right? And so I had like two kids who were like little ass kickers. And so, at like 2 years old, he would walk over like to the corner and say, and just stare. And be like, Charlie, what are you staring at? It's like, there's a man there, right? And then he would run away. I was like, he's scared. And no, he went to go get like a tennis racket and like threw it against the wall. And now, could it be his imagination? It could be. But the thing that you find, I've become a certified meditation teacher actually in the last year. And because I really am interested in the cities and I want to experience it. But I do believe that when you're able to quiet yourself, when you have the quiet mind of a child, when you're kind of present in the moment, I think you can see things that you can't necessarily see when you're an adult, when you're worried about bills, you're worried about your children, you're worried about your mother. You got all these worries and all these things that are going on inside your head. You don't experience stillness. But I think children can experience stillness. And I think not even yogis, but anyone who practices like meditation or prayer can experience these quiet moments. These really, and it goes beyond just quiet. There's a certain stillness. And when you experience that stillness, you become very, very open to the fact that there may be, I think there is, a reality that exists that we can't necessarily touch or see, and that influences us every day. So, good. Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Oh, GaryJansen.com if you ever have any questions, or check out Holy Ghost. It's back on sale on Amazon. It got sold out this month, but or check out the audio. I really love doing the audiobook and reading the audiobook. Check it out.